Hey guys, what's happening? It's Jay from Sony Alpha Lab, and what I got here is the Sony RX100 Mark VII. I got another quick tutorial here, and this time I'm going to show you how to do HDR photography. There's two different ways to do HDR photography, and you might wonder, Jay, what the hell is HDR photography? It stands for High Dynamic Range Photography. Now, what that means is when a scene has too much dynamic range for the camera sensor to capture. So the camera sensor can only capture so much information in a given scene. So for example, if you have a lot of dark shadowy area and a really bright sky, the camera is not going to be able to capture the really bright sky and the dark shadowy area in one frame. It's just not possible. The camera is only capable of capturing so much dynamic range. So HDR photography will take multiple exposures at different EV values, different exposure values, and it'll capture different information on each of those exposures. So for example, you can take an exposure at +2 EV and the camera will get all the shadow detail. Then the camera can take an exposure at -2 EV and it'll get all the detail in the bright sky, for example. And then it'll take a shot at 0 EV and just for a normal exposure. You could then blend these 3 frames together and get a killer HDR photo. High dynamic range. That's basically what it is. So the Sony RX100 and pretty much all the Sony cameras, by the way, work the same way in this regard. They all have this feature called Auto HDR. Now, Auto HDR, you do have to be in JPEG mode, so it's not the greatest quality, but it's really good for straight off the camera. And I'll show you how to set that up in a second. The other method is bracketing. When you use bracketing, I recommend using raw quality. So you'll basically take 3 separate photos using raw quality at different exposure values. You can also take more than 3 exposures, but in this demonstration, I'm going to show you how to do it with just 3. After you take those 3 exposures for your HDR scene, you basically bring them onto your computer, and then you use your computer to process those 3 files in an HDR processing program. In my case, I'm using HDR Effects Pro, and it works really well. I'll show you how to use it. There's tons of programs out there, though, that you can use. Some of them are free, some of them you gotta pay for. They all basically work the same way. They just blend the 3 exposures together. It takes the highlight detail from one, the shadow detail from the other, blends them together, and then pumps out a result. Before we continue with this tutorial, please, below the video, hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and if you found this video useful, please consider sharing it with your friends. Also, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. It lets other people know, hey, this is a good video, check it out, thumbs up. Also, below the video, if you hit that show more, or there's a little arrow tab if you're on a mobile device, you can go below the video and there's all information below the video. I got links for all sorts of cool stuff and I really appreciate the support, guys. Let's get on with this video. Alright guys, so like I already discussed, there's 2 different methods for HDR photography, and of course I'm using the Sony RX100 Mark VII for this demonstration. And let me show you how to use the first method, which I would consider the easier method. It's Auto HDR and it's built in, so the camera does all the work for you and basically just pumps out a nice result. So basically what you need to do is, if you go into the menu, you want to make sure that you're in JPEG quality. It's critical you're in JPEG quality or this feature won't work. So make sure you have JPEG quality selected, then or JPEG format. Then under JPEG quality, have it set to extra fine for the best quality possible. So JPEG format and then extra fine. Now, the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to scroll over to the right and go into drive mode. Now scroll down, select drive mode, and then you're going to want to set your self timer. 2 seconds usually will do the trick. That will make sure that you don't get any camera shake when you start your exposure process, as you'll see in a second. So just select 2 seconds, and you could make that longer if you want, 5 seconds. Sometimes you might prefer. And you absolutely should be using a tripod when doing this, but you can do it handheld, and you will see some samples that I took doing it handheld. So you don't have to use the self timer. You could absolutely just handhold and do it that way as well. But for the best results possible, you really do want to use a tripod and self timer, especially if you have longer exposures. So moving over to the right here, we're going to look for the HDR / Dynamic Range Optimizer, and you can see it right here, DRO / Auto HDR. And right now it's set to off. So if you go in there, just scroll down to HDR. And now you can go left or right with the arrows. So depending on how dynamic your scene is, you can change this number. Now I usually start at an EV level of 4. Seems to work pretty good. So now that I have the camera all set up, I am just going to take a picture. So notice the 2-second self timer. Notice how it took 3 separate shots. Now, let me show you the more advanced method, which is really the best way to do it, and that's using the drive mode and bracketing, and then doing the processing of the raw files on your computer. So let me go into the menu, and let me turn this feature off. So I'm going to turn Dynamic Range Optimizer / Auto HDR off. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the left here and select raw quality under file format, raw quality. There we go, like so. Then I'm going to go to the right and I'm going to go into bracket settings. And if you go into bracket settings, you have this option self timer during bracketing. I have that set to 2 seconds. Next thing we're going to want to do, if I hit the menu, I will go back. You're going to want it to go into drive mode. Now in drive mode, you're going to scroll down and you have bracket right here. See bracket C? That stands for bracketing continuous. And again, you have the arrows left or right. So you can go and you can change your EVs. 1 EV, 9 exposures, 2 EV, 3 exposures, 2 EV, 5 exposures, 3 EV at 3 exposures. So I particularly like 2 EVs and 3 exposures. That generally works, but if you need more dynamic range, you can always up it to 5. But a 2 EV spread works really well, I find, for the most part. So start there, and you could always expand and try different things depending on your results. So now that that's set, basically all you have to do is point, shoot, and let go. And notice it took 3 separate exposures, this time in raw quality. Alright guys, so here we are in Lightroom, and I just wanted to go over the quick test shots I took so you can see the difference, and then we'll move on to real world photos where I can show you how this actually works in the real world. But let's first take a look at these 2 test shots I took using Auto HDR. Now on the left is the regular exposure. So that's a non-Auto HDR shot. On the right is the Auto HDR. Now look at the shadow detail here on the wheel and on the black of the wheel. You can see how there's much more detail in the shadow area on the Auto HDR image, which is on the right hand side. Also, look at the highlights here, the chrome. There's more detail in the chrome on the Auto HDR image as opposed to the non-Auto HDR image. So that's basically how Auto HDR works. Now, this was just a test shot. This really isn't the greatest example. Now, here are the bracketed shots. So this is the normal exposure. This is the -2 EV exposure. And this is the positive 2V exposure. So you can see how Auto HDR is basically doing the same thing as bracketing, except it's just doing it automatically and then combining the images for you. Again, look at the Auto HDR versus the regular. See how the wheels brightened up? And then if you look at this bracketed shot, you could see the bright wheels on the bracket shot. So the Auto HDR is a very powerful feature and it works quite good. But let me show you what real HDRs look like when you take 3 separate raw files and combine them. So for example, here is a killer waterfall scene at Caterskill Falls, it's called. So I took 3 separate exposures. Now here is the normal exposure, and as you can see from a normal exposure, the shadow detail is a little bit dark and the highlight detail on the top of the frame where the sky is just blown out. It sucks. Because of the time of day and the lighting, this is the best I could do. So I put the camera in bracketing mode like I showed you just a second ago, and I took 3 separate exposures. Here is the -2 exposure, and here is the +2 exposure. So you can see this one has all the shadow detail, this one has all the highlight detail on the sky here, and then the regular exposure has just a regular exposure, what the camera would normally get. Then when you combine them using software, and in my case I use HDR Effects Pro, I got this result. So you could see just how amazing this is. Now look at the regular exposure versus the HDR exposure. It's a night and day difference. It looks way better in pretty much every way, in my opinion. So that's basically how it works. Now here's another example. Here is the normal exposure that you would get just taking a regular snapshot. Here's a -2 exposure, so you could see I have the highlight detail here. And if you look at the histogram, you could see almost all the highlight detail is there. Enough is there that the image will come out great when it's processed. Now here is the shadow detail. Now in this one, you get all the shadow detail on these rocks and in the water, and etc. But the sky is clearly blown out. Now look what happens when you combine the three. You get this killer result like this. Let me move on here and show you how to actually process a real HDR using HDR Effects Pro. So basically what I would do is I would click on all three of these images. So I would click on all three like so. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on the image and I'm going to go to Export. Then I'm going to scroll up and I'm going to go to HDR Effects Pro. Now this program used to be provided by Google and it was free. It now is owned by DxO and you do have to pay for it, but you can do a free trial. There is a lot of other HDR editing software out there, but I really prefer this one, and plus it was free when I got it and it still works on my Mac, so I'm using this. I really think it works awesome. So just click that and it'll automatically start processing the photos. The first thing that happens is it pops up to this screen here and it's showing you the different EV values. Now you have alignment, ghost reduction, and strength, and then chromatic aberrations. Now, ghost reduction is useful if you have subjects like this where there might be leaves blowing and things like that. So what you can do is you can click this magnifying glass and then you can drag it up to your scene to where you want to see the ghosting. And you can see if there's any ghosting going on. And it looks pretty good so far. And you can select a different image if you want for your ghosting reference. I think this middle exposure looks the best. Now chromatic aberration, you can click this little tab here and you can adjust your chromatic aberration. And what that is those fringing that you might get like in the blues and the purples and stuff. So you can adjust your chromatic aberration over here on the right hand side. And this setting right here where I have it is pretty good for this particular image. I already edited an image similar to this and I adjusted my sliders like so to get rid of the purple and the blue fringing that I was seeing up here in the super high contrast area. So once that's done, you basically just click Create HDR. And this program's awesome because it has all these presets over here, as you'll see in a second, which is what I tend to use. So here's what it looks like default straight out of the HDR Effects Pro software. But if you scroll down here, you have all these different presets. Now I particularly like this one, Deep 1 and Deep 2. So Deep 2 is a little bit more realistic than Deep 1 in my opinion. So I usually use Deep 2. And then on the right hand side you have all these options to control. Now what I'm noticing is the highlights are just a little bit too bright over here. So I'm going to go over here to my exposure highlights and I'm going to drag that down a bit. Now look over here on the scene. You can see now I'm getting a little bit of that highlight cloud detail back. You can drag the highlights down and get all that detail back in the sky. You can do the same thing with the shadows. The shadows are looking pretty good, but you can raise it up or you could lower it down. I'm actually going to lower it down a little bit just for a more realistic shot. And again, you can play with the method strength, tonal compression. It's extremely versatile. You can drag the structure up to give the image just a little bit more punch, but you could also do that in Lightroom if you would like to. Saturation, you can control that how you want. You can jack it all the way up. It looks a little bit unrealistic. Bring it back down like so. Finishing touches. I like to add a little bit of a vignette here, so I'm just going to choose Lens 2, and then you just click Save. That's pretty much all there is to it. And here it is. So as you can see, just look how much better that looks. Here's the regular exposure, and here's the HDR. It's phenomenal. And it definitely works better than Auto HDR, but like I said, Auto HDR works pretty darn good too. So it's two different methods you can use, and I used the Sony RX100 Mark VII for this demonstration. Like that's where these files came from. So you can see the camera is extremely powerful, even though it has just that 1-inch sensor. Let me just show you one more thing quick. I can actually crop this down just a little bit. To get rid of that branch on the top, like so. And then I can add just a little bit more of a vignette like so. Bring that up, bring the feather up that little bit. Then what I can do is I can add a little bit of clarity, a little bit more vibrance, and I can add a medium contrast just to give it a little bit more. Then I could add just a little bit of shadow. And that's just a final tweak to the image. That pretty much wraps up this video, guys. I really hope you got something that you were looking for. If you have any questions, please ask below the video. I'd be more than happy to help. Also, please let me know what you think your favorite HDR editing software is. I'd love to hear it, and if there's something better out there, I'd be more than willing to give it a shot, that's for sure. Please have a great day, and I will catch up with you next time. Take care.